the springtime when the earth is new, to the fairies they draw near.
Hey everyone, it's Jonathan and welcome back to our series on Disney's Peter Pan. Today we're kicking off a 3-part miniseries on the Tinkerbell franchise, a series of movies that started out as a line of direct-to-DVD films but ended up becoming a semi-successful theatrical franchise in their own right. Joining me for this series is Katie Fabrick. I'd been planning to cover these films for my Peter Pan series either way, but I was an adult when these came out, and since I'd never watched them before, I figured there probably wasn't a ton to talk about. I figured I could just do one podcast on the whole franchise and call it a day. But as soon as I found out that Katie actually kind of grew up with these movies, I knew she had to be the one to join me. I figured she'd have a much more interesting perspective than someone my age, who'd probably never watched them when they came out and would just be watching them out of curiosity for the podcast. And I was correct. Probably a bit too correct, because what I assumed would be like an hour-long podcast somehow turned into a nearly 3-hour conversation, and even editing out tangents and stuff, still, it's just too much for one episode. So it's going to be 3. There are 6 movies and 2 specials to talk about, so today we're going to talk about the first film as well as the origins of the franchise as a whole, and next time we'll move on to the next 2 films and the 2 specials, and then in the final episode we'll talk about the last 3 films of the series. So today we'll kick things off with the movie that started it all, 2008's Tinkerbell. I guess before we get into the movies, can you tell me your familiarity with this series? Because for me, this is the first time I've ever watched any of these.
Yeah.
Like, I was aware of them as they were coming out, but I think I was in college. So they weren't something that I or my family watched. I knew they existed, but never had an opportunity, or I didn't even really care to watch them. They didn't look that interesting. Like, I was already, I don't know how, like, if I would describe myself as a huge Disney fan at that point, but I was aware that the Disney direct-to-video movies weren't that great. I don't think I would have, well, I mean, by that point, I probably was derisively calling them the cheapquels. So this probably would have fallen into that. Like, I feel like this is kind of the last gasp of the direct-to-video stuff that Disney was doing.
Yeah.
Because I think at this point, this was supposed to be like a direct-to-video thing. I think these all did end up going to theaters.
Oh, did they?
I think so. I think the first couple had a more limited run, but like this was the point where John Lasseter came in and he like killed the direct-to-video line. This is the only one that really survived, but he wanted it fully retooled.
Okay.
But yeah, how old were you when this came out, and how many of these were you watching as they came out? Were you like a huge fan?
So the way I ended up watching most of these is I was in my mid-teens when these came out, and they weren't ever really on my radar until the second one came out, because I had a sibling who was 4 and saw Tinkerbell. It was like, I love Peter Pan, and I'm gonna grab the one with Tinkerbell on. And so we actually rented the second one first, and we were just like, oh, it's just the Tinkerbell spin-off direct-to-DVD movie. We didn't realize that like there was a first one. And so we watched the second one, and my sibling fell in love with it, like full blown. We watched it so many times. Eventually with like Netflix, we watched it so many times. We found out about the first one. We watched that one. I had seen every single one. And then, like, as my sibling got older, I had other siblings who had watched it with them. So, like, they started loving it. So I watched Tinkerbell for, like, the good run of the entirety of it so many times, because just, like, all my siblings all, like, fell in love with it, and they all had their favorites. And so we would watch more than others. And then I had seen everyone more than once, probably more than like 4 times before, except the last one, because at that point, all of my siblings had gotten too old or just weren't interested in that anymore. And they all collectively agreed that the last one was the worst one. So I never got to see that one.
Really? I thought they kept getting better as the series went on.
Yeah, like I'll dive more into my thoughts about each one but it was really funny because like I had never seen that last one
Okay.
because they watched that one without me, and then everyone was like, we don't like that one. I think it's just because it didn't have like the characters they liked
Mm,
the most in it.
that is true. It was a lot different than the others, which is partly why I liked it so much better.
Like there are a lot of fan favorite characters in my family growing up, and like we do regularly quote a lot of lines from the ones that we watch. Like I'm rewatching it and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I forgot this was a quote from a Tinkerbell movie." Like because it just became part of our vocabulary at this point, and none of us remembered where it was from.
Oh,
Just like and like I watched a few of my the first sibling of mine that got into it with them, and they're just like, "Oh no, like just we could perfectly quote a line exactly on time to when it was going to happen." We were like, "Okay," and then three, two, one, snail goes, "Ah!" we're like, we're just like we could perfectly quote very specific scenes, and it was like funny because we're like, "Oh yeah, here comes the snail." The snail's in it for like 2 seconds, but we're like, I remember that that was somebody like the person just loved seeing the snail and thought it was the most funniest thing in the entire movie. So like we all remember the snail, even though the snail had nothing to do with it. So it's really funny watching that and like knowing exactly how a specific thing is going to happen, even though I haven't watched these movies in a very long time. And I guess they're nostalgic to me, not because I actively sought them out. I thought they were fine, but because I had so many siblings who all went through the steps of loving them. I think my review of all the Tinkerbell movies, or they're all like harmless fun
uh-huh.
that it's not a chore to sit through most of the time.
I think I feel pretty much the exact same way.
And some of them are better than others.
Yes.
Some of them I'm like, why? Like, I do know because I was like watching all of them again. I'm like, I probably would never watch some of these again. I might like even if I got the urge, I'd be like, oh yeah, remember that movie? Yeah, I'm pretty content with never watching it again. But like it's not that I'm upset that I've watched them or I'm
Hmm.
like revisiting a movie I loved and I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I love that? And so they're just like they're pretty basic, but they have enough plot and character and story that's going on that you just sit down and like can kind of turn your brain off for a bit. It's not asking for a lot of you to invest a lot into it. So
Hmm.
you can just kind of like it can be a bit of a relief. And I think that's something I miss from direct to DVD films. A lot of them usually have that to them where they're not really asking a lot from you.
Hmm.
So like you can be like, "Oh my gosh, I love, like Del Toro's Pinocchio, but that movie makes me so sad that I can't watch it all the time."
Hmm.
But like the Tinkerbell movies, like if they personally I enjoyed them more, I think that they're fine. But like if I really was into them, I'd be like, I could watch this movie just to sit down and be calm and know that it's not asking a lot from me. And I think that that's a reason why a lot of the older kids and the younger kids, and as the younger kids like grew up and they became the older kids and then younger and then the new wave of younger kids, and that's like why it kind of like connected with a lot of people no matter their age or their gender, and we all could just like sit down and watch it
Hmm.
because it was very harmless and it wasn't like aimed towards really anything, and it had a complex enough world that it wasn't like boring, so
Hmm.
that you could kind of have an enjoyment. You got to see the characters again. So most of the time, if you had a character that you enjoyed in the last movie, you could see them again, and maybe they don't do anything, but you're like, oh, there's the character I loved. Everyone would kind of have their favorite character, and then you could all like be like, yeah, here comes my favorite part because I love Silver Mist and she shows up and she's funny, and so you've got like everyone can collect it, but like there's no character who's too annoying that you are like, ugh, I just can't put up with that character most of the time. Usually, like they're at best, like you're like, they're okay. Like that, I mean, at the worst, at best they're okay. No, at the worst they're all right. but usually they're not in it very much. And I think majority of the characters aren't in it very much.
Are you talking about Bobble and Clank?
See, Bobble and Clank, if this was the first time I watched it, they would be the most annoying things because they just don't do anything. But they were huge, especially amongst my brothers.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So like I don't hate them. I think that it was a good choice to kind of make them dwindle as the movies go on. Like if they were in it more, but I think they're fine. I could be a bit biased too because I love Rob Paulson and Jeff Bennett, and I think that it's always just fun to hear them.
Yeah, I thought the same thing, but I didn't love the characters, especially
Yeah,
I liked Bobble a lot better than Clank.
yeah. Like they can get a bit irritating. And I appreciate that they're really not in it very much. And I think that's the thing. Like you
Mhm.
start getting annoyed with a character a bit and then they leave and you're like, okay, we're good. You know? Like they don't get to that point of I can't watch this movie because I find this character so annoying. And you're
Uh-huh.
like, just get off the screen. You're like, okay, that scene's finally over. We can keep going now.
Mhm. I feel like I don't want to say like the biggest problem because I don't know that other than the fact that it's kind of direct to video quality, I don't feel like these are bad.
Hmm.
They're just fine. But I feel
Yeah.
like the biggest problem that I see is that these are very movie by committee, maybe would be a good way of putting
Yeah.
it. There's not really one person who has a singular vision. Like they loved Tinkerbell and they loved the world of the fairies and they wanted to make this huge franchise based around that.
Yeah.
It might have started that way, but like there's too many people coming in and like it was rewritten so many times.
Yeah, there's a lot of retconning and lore going on.
I was noticing that as they went on.
It's like you can't think too hard about how everything works. And then
Yes.
like they introduce like I was talking about how I hadn't seen the first one in a while and I'm like, there's no other Dust Keeper fairies except for Terrence in the first film. And like the first film almost gives you the impression that he's the only Dust Keeper fairy. And
I
then
wouldn't have
suddenly
I
there's
watched that
an
one first, so I wouldn't have noticed that until if I went back, maybe I would notice. But you're
yeah,
right. Yeah. Because that really got fleshed out more and more as the series went on.
yeah, like suddenly you realize that, oh, it's not just one guy running the entire thing, it's like an entire corporation handing out pixie dust all of a sudden. I don't know what they were up to. Maybe the machines were broken that day and just he was the only one, or everyone was going out and partying or something. It was the day off and he's the unlucky one who had to still work. But it is a little like, where are they? And then like the whole winter fairy thing, like the first movie, they fly through the winter area
Oh,
and they're
they
like, it's
did?
yeah, like they're like showing off the different seasons and like, and this is the cold one, brr, and you're like, yep, okay, we're gonna retcon that hard in the next few movies.
It would be like I'm not going to go back and rewatch these, but it would be interesting to go back having now seen the whole series because like the first half of these I watched a few weeks ago. I thought I was going to get through them all while I was sick, and then I had too many other things going on, and I
Hmm.
only finished the last bunch yesterday and today. So it would be interesting to go back and watch the ones that I watched a few weeks ago, having just watched the ones where I would assume the majority of the retconning is taking place.
Yeah.
As I kept seeing things, I was like, wait a minute, didn't they say this in this other film and now they're doing this? That doesn't
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah, like I think the retcons really just like really pick up in the third because like it's like they have this summer camp and it's like
That was the first thing that I noticed because I watched that one a few weeks ago too, and I watched it
mhm.
right after having watched the others. I was like, wait a minute, I thought they weren't allowed to go to the
Yeah, it's
mainland.
like did they just go to did they just go to summer camp without the Tinker Fairies? Like did the Tinker Fairies just not are they not invited to the summer camp because that's are we just gonna brush over that? Okay, yeah. Okay.
There was a lot
Like
of seemingly very arbitrary rules about who was and was not allowed to do certain things.
yeah. I remember in like the pirate fairy, she gets fired from being a dust keeper fairy. And I'm like, so wait a minute, what happens to a fairy once they get fired? because like their entire life revolves around this talent of theirs. Like, do
Uh-huh.
you become a hobo fairy? Like, is there an entire area of just fired fairies that just can't no longer have a purpose in life? Can
Now I
you
want a movie about a hobo fairy.
like I'm just so it was like, no, no, don't think because this is a direct DVD movie
Yeah, yeah.
which is created to sell dolls. Like, don't think too hard. And it is very blatant, like that this is a created to sell dolls to kids. Like it wants to be the Barbie kind of a Disney thing,
Uh-huh.
where it's like you each get your own little characters and they're all where they're different. It's kind of like My Little Pony in that sense, where you have your different characters who each have a different talent
Each one has a
and
different color.
different color scheme exactly, and you can collect them and they get different outfits for different movies, so now you get to have more little dolls and all that kind of stuff. So like it's very transparent, I think, about that, and I guess that's kind of why I kind of probably am a bit more lenient towards it. I'm not saying that, oh, a mass marketed movie for kids, but to an extent they didn't have to make a story be cohesive. Like it could have been
Hmm.
far worse, I guess.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like I understand what it is, and for what it isn't bad. There are better like things that are created, in my opinion, to just like sell toys. Like I like the Transformers franchise, not the Michael Bay movies, but the I like the Transformers franchise and I watch some of the cartoons and stuff. And obviously it's just there to sell you a toy. But, it's like when you take that concept and you turn it into a story, I appreciate that, like, yeah, you're blatantly just trying to sell me toys, but
You're doing it well.
you're doing it well. And I appreciate the creativity that you put behind it instead of just it being it's all a commercial, but I appreciate you knowing that my time is important to
Uh-huh.
make this commercial enjoyable.
That's probably why I didn't feel like this was terrible, because I
Mm-hmm.
know this is the kind of thing that a lot of people would watch and say, this is horrible. But I've watched a lot of things that are actually horrible
Yeah.
doing all my various podcasts, especially like with all the versions of Alice in Wonderland that I've seen
Mm-hmm.
for every version ever. Like there are ones that people make purely because somebody said they had to make something and they put the bare minimum effort into it.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible character design, really cheap animation. This somebody cared enough to make an actual good movie out of. Not that it's
Yeah.
like amazing and it's not like Pixar level, but it's good enough that you can watch this and you're not looking at your watch wondering how much time is left on this thing.
Yeah.
It goes by pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit forgettable, but like while you're watching, it's not a chore.
Yeah.
I guess we can go through some of the cast because I found the cast a bit interesting, especially for
Mm-hmm.
the main fairies and especially for the first movie. There was some recasts that happened
Yeah.
like as the series went on, some people left. But to start out with, you have Mae Whitman as Tinkerbell. Had you seen Mae Whitman in anything else?
Um, I think she's in The Last Airbender.
Okay.
I think she's been in a couple cartoons, like voice work that I've watched.
Hmm.
So, but like I'm not like hugely familiar with her.
The thing that I was most familiar with her was she was in a show called Good Girls.
Uh-huh.
Had I ever talked about, I know I talked about that with somebody. Was that you or
I
was it
th
somebody
it's
else?
that it's the one about like women and they decide they're gonna like steal or something, right?
Yes. Well, it's complicated. They end up I think
Okay.
they rob a grocery store first because they all have like various money troubles and they're like all desperate, like desperately desperate, and they have no other choice. So they
Mm-hmm.
rob this grocery store, but a bunch of stuff happens and they end up getting roped into basically becoming counterfeiters and they basically become organized criminals.
Okay.
And she's one of the main three. And I really like her in that show. Like I liked the show, but it was one of those shows where it wasn't as bad as Breaking Bad, but it gave me that kind of
Uh,
anxiety watching
yeah.
it because they're doing terrible things. There's terrible things happening. And even though it was like kind of a comedy, it was also it was a comedy drama, but they leaned a lot more
Mm-hmm.
heavily into drama at points. But the cast was fantastic, and Mae Whitman was great. And that's the main place that I know her from. So it was interesting to see her go from a criminal grocery store robbing counterfeiter organized criminal to
Yeah.
Tinkerbell.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I know her from Avatar: The Last Airbender because she plays Katara. So
Hmm.
that's where I know her from. So that's not a huge jump for me, but that is funny that she's also like that. That'd be so weird, like watching like an MA live action TV show. It's just like I'm Tinkerbell. You're like ah. Like I'm assuming. I mean, maybe she does sound very different, but I'm gonna assume she doesn't. So like that just be really. I've always find it funny when you're watching something randomly, and you've heard this voice for so long, and then you actually see the person in a thing,
Mm.
and you're like, whoa, like oh my gosh, that's weird.
I feel like I'm going to look at her IMDb because I feel like I was looking at her IMDb a few weeks ago and there was something on it that surprised me. Something from like when she was a kid, because she was a child actress, I believe.
Hmm.
Oh, she was the little girl in Independence Day. I think she was the president's daughter.
Oh, okay. I have never seen that, but
She was also the child in a movie that my cousins really love called A Season for Miracles. It was like a Hallmark Hall of Fame movie.
uh-huh.
Yeah, I think that was what the thing that jumped out at me. It's weird to find out that somebody you're watching now was somebody you knew way back when in a movie when they were a little kid.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Well, other than Mae Whitman, another person who lasted through the whole series was Raven
Yeah.
as Iridessa. I don't know if they like there was a lot of Disney synergy going on here, so I don't know if she was given this role because she was that so Raven, but I like that she's in it. I really like Raven. So anything that she's in, it's always puts it up another notch in my book because I just like her as a
Hmm.
person.
Yeah, she's fun.
I love her voice.
Yeah.
She never has a huge role in any of these, but it's nice that she's there.
Yeah.
And then Lucy Liu as Silver Mist.
Hmm.
I think she would, those three are the three that last through the whole series. There's other like side characters that do as well, but those three are the three main ones. I guess you could also count Pamela Adlon as Vidya. Like
Yeah.
she started out as an antagonist, but by the end of the series, she was one of the main friend fairies. So I guess she lasted through the whole series.
Hmm.
But Kristen Chenoweth also was here at the beginning as Rosetta, and she ended up getting replaced halfway through. I'm gonna guess it wasn't so much being replaced as she got too famous and had too many other things to do.
Yeah.
And then the one who lasted the least amount of time was America Ferrera, who played Fawn, the animal fairy. She was in the
Hmm.
first movie and then none of the others.
And then every other side character was voiced by Jeff Bennett and Rob Paulson. I kid, but there was like you'd be like, "Oh, hi, Rob Paulson."
There
Oh,
was a
hi, Jeff.
large amount of side characters or one-off characters that I could tell were somebody who was elsewhere in the movie as well. So it was
Yeah.
like they're saving money by using who they already have.
Hmm.
But I mean, if you have Rob Paulson and Jeff Bennett, you might as well use
Yeah.
them to the best of their abilities.
Right. Exactly.
Another name that jumps out at me is Jane Horrocks as Fairy Mary, who was in several of them.
Hmm.
The only reason that she jumps out to me is because she played Babs in Chicken Run. Otherwise, I'm not familiar with the name, but I think she's an English comedian. So,
Mm.
and then the only other big name, at least from the first one, is Angelica Houston, who played Queen Clarion.
Hmm.
I think she was in most of the movies. She might have not been in one or two, but like she was kind of someone who was in the background of everything.
Yeah. She'd show up and be like, "Oh goodness, what happened?" And they're just like, "Oh, Queen." And then she was like, "We'll fix it. Goodbye." Um,
Kind of.
yeah.
Well, I guess before we go into what the movie is about, I did write down a bunch of behind the scenes stuff
Hmm.
because this movie went through a lot before it actually was able to come out. It apparently had at least 2 dozen scripts and multiple directors before they landed on what actually became the movie. the early draft was called Tinkerbell and the Ring of Belief, and there was actually promotional material made for a movie with that title. And it apparently revolved around Tinkerbell and her friends traveling to the mainland to restore children's belief in fairies,
Okay.
which sounds really like all of these are very corporate movies, but this that really sounds like something that a suit made up. And the first movie was also originally going to show how Tinkerbell met Peter Pan,
Okay.
and Captain Hook, the pirates, and the Lost Boys were all supposed to be featured as well.
Okay.
And apparently, they even had some trailers that were in a few DVDs that were released. I'm not sure when those came out, and it doesn't say what movies they were, but it was originally promoted as going to be released in 2007, which obviously that did not happen.
Yeah.
And then a bunch of things happened. Apparently, 90% of the film was completely scrapped, and it was delayed to 2008 with an entirely new storyline.
Huh.
According to a June 2007 article in Variety, Sharon Morrill, the head of Disney Toon's direct-to-DVD division since 1994, was removed from her position due to problems with this film, including a budget that had expanded to almost $50 million
Wow.
for a direct-to-video movie. And this is the point when John Lasseter and Ed Catmull were given leadership of Walt Disney Feature Animation
Mm.
after Disney purchased Pixar. And even though Disney Toons was not under their management, they apparently got really involved in the movies. I think that's about the time where they basically scrapped all of the ones that were in development except for this. Because I
Yeah.
remember back in the day, I don't remember what it was, but I know I watched a movie, and before the movie, there was a preview for Dumbo 2.
Okay.
So something, I'm sure that was one of the ones that he scrapped because at some point there was going to be a Dumbo 2 and then it was canceled, which is probably for the best.
Yeah.
We
It's
did
like, oh
not need a
no.
Dumbo 2.
Oh no. Too bad. Oh well.
Apparently, at the time, Lasseter said that the Tinkerbell movie was virtually unwatchable and it would have
Mm.
hurt both Walt Disney Feature Animation and Disney Consumer Products line. So Morrill was moved to special projects, and the status of the movie was in doubt. And Disney Observer Jim Hill reported at the time that complications surrounding the film had resulted in the decision that Disney would no longer produce straight to DVD sequels to its feature films, which also led to later sequels to Tinkerbell seeing a theatrical release. I think they were more limited than what you would get with a normal movie, but they did end up in theaters,
Okay.
which I don't think that they ended up in theaters around me. I feel like it was too limited to get to
Yeah.
my small town because I don't remember these being theatrical. I, I remember thinking of them as direct to DVD movies.
Yeah, because like the first time I started watching them was first I rented them from the library and then Netflix came along. So like
Hmm.
we watched them on Netflix when they came out because they steadily showed up on Netflix. So that's like we would watch them as they came out on Netflix. So I thought they were just like direct to DVD slash streaming, but I guess they went to theaters.
I feel like, especially for the first one, but for the most part, most of this series, this felt more like a show than a movie.
Hmm.
Like it felt like maybe a long episode of a cartoon that you would find on the Disney Channel,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it didn't really feel like a movie.
No, like I feel like if I had seen it in the theaters, I'd be more disappointed in it.
Yeah.
Because like going to the theaters, and that's not to say that like I don't have some direct to DVD films that I wouldn't love to see in the theaters, but like going to the theaters takes up a lot of hyping for myself personally. Like I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna sit in the dark with a bunch of strangers. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a really loud movie. I can do this because I just really want to watch because like watching the movie for me has to be worth it to go into the theaters. And so like if I had gone in there and I walked out and I had just watched like Tinkerbell, I would have been like, yeah, that was not worth me having to like hype myself up. And I'd be like, I couldn't hype myself up to go to the theaters to see Tinkerbell.
Hmm. Well, the first movie is basically an origin story for Tinkerbell, which I guess makes sense, but I feel like, and this is the thing with the entire series, it does not feel like the same character from Peter Pan.
No, she seems very different. It has like a soft reboot
Yeah.
vibe to it. It feels like it's in the same world, but it is not it's a different take on that world.
Hmm. I did read that they were eventually planning on having her meet Peter Pan.
Mm,
Like, I think it would have been movie 8 because the series was canceled after the sixth movie.
yeah.
But I still wonder how that would have worked. And would they have said that this is canon to the Peter Pan films? Because this character is so, so different than the Tinkerbell and Peter Pan. Because the Tinkerbell and Peter Pan, like, I'm not going to say she's evil, but she can be nasty.
Oh yeah,
She's
no.
not a nice person.
No, she really leans into that original idea of fairies being little like annoyances.
Yeah.
Like they're little tricky annoyances.
Uh-huh. And this one, she's just sweet and kind and curious and inventive and a completely different character.
No, definitely. She's way more like protagonist and she'll listen to people most of the time and stuff. I think like with the second one they try to lean more into her like getting all red in the face and stuff, but like that quickly fades away
Hmm.
from like her anger controls her and it's like but like in the second movie she learns to deal with that so like it never becomes an issue again because they live in an ideal world where if you have a problem once and you find the solution it never becomes a problem again.
Well, I think the way they start this out, it's been so long since I've read Peter Pan, but I feel like there's a passage that talks about fairies being born, like when a newborn baby laughs for the first time,
Yeah,
its laugh breaks into 1,000 pieces and each piece becomes a fairy, something
yeah,
like
so
that.
yeah, along those lines, yeah.
So they're kind of going with that, except in this version, when the baby laughs, the laugh becomes a fairy. It's not like the laugh breaks up and becomes 1,000 fairies or whatever. It's
Yeah,
just each baby's laugh is a fairy, which
yeah.
they retcon in a later movie, but we'll get to that. But they have her being born and flying from the real world to Neverland. Then she has like a ceremony that is basically the fairy version of the Harry Potter sorting hat ceremony. They have all of these things that like she has to choose one or it chooses her or something like a hammer glows for her. So that means that she's a Tinker Fairy,
Yeah.
which that is canon to the novel too. It in the book, that's what she's described as, a Tinker Fairy. So everything that she does, as far as like the inventive stuff, it technically does come from the book, even though her as a character is very different. That idea of her being a Tinker Fairy does come from the book.
Hmm.
In the book, one of the things that I wrote down was she was described as one of the fairies who mended pots and kettles. That also begs the question. So she's named Tinkerbell because she's a Tinker Fairy, but why aren't all the other fairies named after their professions?
Now why isn't it Tinker Bobble and
Yeah.
Tinkler Clank? Come on. I mean I guess like because like then it'd be fast flying Vidya, which is ridiculous.
I also have questions about like why fast flying? Why is that a specific
Yeah, it's
profession?
like my favorite like everyone feels almost kind of like elements, you've got like nature, you've got water, you've got light, and then you've got animal fairy, which is kind of in the similar vein. Tinkers pushing it and then just fast it's like fast flying. And you're like, you didn't want to call them, like wind fairies? Like
That
because they
that
can control the
that
wind.
really confused me because I assumed because she controls the wind, I assumed that fast flying was just what they called weather fairies. But then in a later thing, you've got storm fairies, and I was like, what?
Yeah.
So why is that different than from what Vidya is?
Like what does Vidya contribute besides flying fast?
Exactly. There was so many times where I had to stop myself and I was like, you are way overthinking this.
Yeah,
But also
it's
that's the
like you
point of
think
this.
It's like you're thinking about this world they've created too much, yet it has enough lore that it causes you to think about it
Yes,
too much.
exactly.
It's not like I'm overthinking a simple thing that you didn't need to think about that. Like if you think about like Pokemon and you're like, well, how does this thing work? And it's like, well, it's a Pokemon world. You don't have to think too much about that. Like all Pokemon come from eggs. That's just a rule. And you're like, but some of them are mammal like, and you're like, don't worry about it. Just all Pokemon from eggs. That's just you overthinking it a bit because they are fictional animal creatures. But then, like, in this, they're like, well, this is how this thing works. And you're like, but wait, that's not exactly how it works exactly. And you're like, but I'm thinking too much. It's a balance of too much lore, but not enough lore.
Yeah. Especially as the series went on and lore started to seem to contradict itself.
Yeah.
One of the first big questions I had was after she's become a Tinker Fairy and she's like getting into things, she finds out that she's not allowed to go to the mainland. So she decides to try and change what kind of fairy she is into another kind of fairy so that she can go to the mainland.
Hmm.
But like, why? Why is she not allowed to go to the mainland?
Yeah, like why can't she just come with them?
Yeah. It was like this hard and fast rule, like you can't break this rule. Tinker fairies are not allowed to go to the mainland. But why? And I think somebody realized that that was a dumb rule because that was quickly retconned before the end of the movie, really, because by the end of the movie, she does go to the mainland. But like, why did they let her if this was a rule that you're not allowed to?
Yeah, it's not like they were like, no, we only can have like maybe Tinker Fairies just don't blend into scenery as well or something. So like it's like you could jeopardize the discovery of fairies. No, it's just Tinker Fairies don't do anything when they go to the mainland, so they can't go. You're not worth it. You're not worth the pixie dust to get there.
That was another thing. Why is pixie dust a limited resource?
It's so funny because in the first movie it just kind of feels like it's a magical thing, and then just like immediately in the second movie it's like, no, we have to ration it. You already got your quarter of the pixie dust for the day. It's kind of felt more like, oh, the pixies, like the fairies have to go and like brush up and get a little bit more pixie dust every so often. That like it was like it didn't require a lot of thought. They just went and they like got like a touch up of pixie dust, and they would just go up there, they get it poured on their head, and then now. But then like immediately they're just like, no, we have this organized system of how you're supposed to get your pixie dust and when you get it, what day, how much you have to get depending on what you do. We have to sneak out pixie dust. Like it's like, what happened?
I suppose I should probably wait until we get to the second movie, but like I had so many questions about the rules for pixie dust and why it worked like this. Which again, I'm probably overthinking it, but like that's the point of the podcast is to think about things. And a lot of people are going to watch this and they really will overthink it because like most worlds like this have some sort of lore that someone has come
Yeah.
up with. But with the Tinkerbell movies, it feels like they just made it up as they went.
Yeah, it's very straight ahead lore is what I call it. Like they don't have set rules planned out they have such a vast world that they don't really have a lot of plans going on, and they're like, well, that wasn't actually really a rule. Like it wasn't that big of a deal, so we could probably just kind of like scoot around it and like create new lore that contradicts it because we had this idea for a story about trying to meet a winter fairy when it's not allowed. Like, and they're like, we never really brought up the winter fairy, so it's basically fine. And it's like, it's very like we came up with an idea as we go along, as opposed to we have a world that has all these rules that we have to follow those rules,
Hmm.
and we can't break them, but we can create stories within that world. It's more of a world that shifts and adapts as they come up with a new idea for a story and a new conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, it felt like the lore changed with the movie. Like every time they got a new movie, the lore had to adapt to the story that they were trying to tell.
I think the biggest issue with that kind of storytelling, especially when you have this society that runs on these rules that supposedly have been going around for thousands and thousands of years, and yet a lot of these things are taught like they're completely new and no one's ever heard about it before. It's like,
I,
oh
fe-
yeah, this is the new thing.
I feel like we should probably get into that in a later movie, but it almost feels like there were two different fairy societies, and the one that they're in now is recent. I'm not like again, I'm probably overthinking it, but different things that they said made me think that the way things work now is very recent to the fairy people.
Yeah.
I don't know. And that's probably something that they didn't even think about when they were writing certain lines that made me think that. But I, again, I'm probably overthinking it, but they should have overthought it before they wrote it.
Yeah, we are overthinking it, but also this is probably stuff that for future writers out there, this is probably stuff that you should be conscious of
Yeah.
and think about as you write your story, that there are rules to a fictional fantasy world that if your audience will notice if you have your main characters fly to the winter world in the first movie and then you make a whole movie where you're not allowed to ever even think about touching the winter world.
This is why a lot of people, when they start a series like this, they will come up with a series Bible. They
Mm-hmm.
will write all of their rules in advance for how things work, and then they will go off of that for not just the first movie, but thinking and planning ahead. But
Yeah.
with this, I I can just pretty much guarantee that they did not have a series Bible for this series.
Yeah, I think it definitely does feel like the very first movie was not planned. It was like maybe it will go out into a series, but like the initial thought process wasn't to turn this into a large thing. It was a bit more of a whilst it was like it can bloom into a series, it wasn't thinking too much about how other movies would be able to operate within the world. It was thinking more about how the world operates in this one specific movie.
It probably was a case of they were planning one movie to be one
Mm-hmm.
of their direct-to-video things. And I think it probably was more successful than they were expecting
Mm-hmm.
because even though, like I said, the budget had ballooned to like $50 million, they did have a brief theatrical release,
Mm-hmm.
which ended with almost $10 million, according to Wikipedia. And like, I don't know how accurate all of the numbers are, but according to Wikipedia, it was almost $10 million from
Mm-hmm.
just the theatrical release. And then DVD sales were over $50 million, and it
Mm-hmm.
sold 22% higher than it was estimated to.
Yeah.
So it did better than they thought it was going to, which probably meant that's why they greenlit the sequel.
Yeah.
But yeah, the rest of the plot of the first movie was pretty simple, with her trying to change her what kind of fairy she is, and eventually she gets tricked by Vidya and accidentally causes some kind of apocalyptic disaster with something called sprinting thistles, which are these plants that run around.
Yeah.
And because she's a Tinker Fairy, she invents ways to fix the mistakes that she's made. She accidentally, like, somehow destroyed spring with these sprinting thistles, but because she invented all these different things to fix her mistakes, she finally is able to accept that she's a Tinker Fairy. And then through all this, for some reason, now she's allowed to go to the mainland. I don't know why. I don't, maybe they said, but I don't remember why they allowed her to go to the mainland.
Yeah. So like the whole reason I think is why they decided to let Tinker Fairies go is because they're like, well, we have all this stuff that gets washed up on shore that comes from the mainland that probably means something to someone. So I think their whole idea was that like whenever you like lose something and then you suddenly find it, that's what Tinker Fairies are doing, even though that doesn't have a whole lot to do with tinkering as the concept. Like the idea is they put it back together and give you your lost toy back.
Well, she
But
did have that music box thing that she
yeah,
eventually leaves for apparently Wendy from Peter Pan.
yeah.
So I guess Wendy must have lost the music box, and that's why she brought it to her.
Yeah.
I guess that makes about as much sense as a lot of things in the movie.
Yeah, I think they were leaning into that was kind of like that's what Tinker Fairies now do. So, like it's like so whenever you lose a toy and you find it again, it's the Tinker Fairies who left it at your door or whatever. Um, and so like in the first movie, Standalone, you're like, oh, okay, so that's what Tinker Fairies do. They find lost things, they put them back together. But then like that's never brought up again. Like
hmm
fixing things for people and all that. Never again. The only thing they do with lost things, as they're called, is they just use them in their contraptions so that they can justify why they have gigantic buttons.
They use them in their contraptions. I mean, that's not wrong. That is what they do with them. One thing I did forget to mention, the music for the movie. It starts out with a narrator, but the narrator is also the songwriter and performer for, I'm not sure if you would call it the theme song. It's To the Fairies They
Mhm.
Draw Near. It's sort of a theme song, but they also have Fly to Your Heart by Selena Gomez for more
Yeah.
Disney synergy, which
Hmm.
they continue to do with the rest of the series. But
Yeah.
Lorena McKennitt is the narrator and performer of To the Fairies They Draw Near. And Joel McNeely is the main composer, but also he has a violin soloist, Mayreed Nesbitt, who I know from my family listened to a lot of Celtic music,
Uh-huh.
specifically Celtic Woman, a group of female singers, but also at times Mayreed Nesbitt. She was one of the main featured artists with Celtic Woman with her violin. So I was pleasantly surprised to find that she had a big part in not just the first movie, she's also in the second movie. And then I guess they decided to not go with the Celtic sound, which I think they
Yeah.
should have had more. But I liked that she was in this.
That's cool.
She doesn't do a whole lot of movies, so it's fun to find her in this.
That's neat.
Okay, so I think we're gonna quit there for today. We talked a lot longer than I expected about Tinkerbell, but we still have 5 movies and 2 specials to go. So in the next episode, we will pick up where we left off and talk about Tinkerbell and the Lost Treasure. But until then, do you want to let people know where they can find you if they want more from you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Katie Draws Things. I draw a lot of cool things over there, and it's a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, we will see you next time for Tinkerbell and the Lost Treasure. Thanks for listening to the Disney Movie Marathon. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and follow my co-hosts as well. My link tree and all of our links will be in the description below. If you want more of my content, all my podcasts are available on YouTube as well as most podcast platforms. If you enjoyed this show, check out one of the other podcasts or check out my Patreon for bonus and extended episodes you won't find anywhere else. We'll be back soon with another brand new episode, so thanks for listening and we'll see you next time.